Good morning, everyone. I'm not as charismatic as George, so please bear with me today. So I am Ika Washington. For those who don't know me, I am the founder of Diversity Talk. My platform was developed through me working in the cannabis space prior to legalization, and having to deal with the barriers as both as a medical patient that uses cannabis as well as a Black woman in the industry. And I built my platform in order to amplify the voices of marginalized and racialized groups. I'm also a PhD student that's doing my PhD in health policy and equity. So for me, this work is very, very important in the work that I do. I work very primarily with Black and Indigenous communities. So for me, the forefront of the work that I do is always looking at how can I make things better for communities that I can not necessarily speak for, but I can speak about, and making sure that they're in these spaces. So I hope that through this conversation that we can also reflect on who we are as people, as well as those that are not able and privileged to be here, but also speak on their, look at their experiences and hopefully guide that conversation through these next 2 days. So with that being said, George really took everything, my goodness. I did want to start by saying that a lot of you do have devices and maybe want to connect to internet, right? Instead of using your data. So with that being said, the internet for this room is an meeting, and it's also the same password as well. So you can connect your devices there. There will be coffee and snacks throughout the entire day as well. Bathrooms are to my left down the hall. And also I just kind of really want to reiterate creating a safe space and making sure that we are very aware of the language we use and how we come across, just because this is a very, very important conversation to have. So I just want to start by saying that as well. I will be around as well if I'm not on stage to answer questions, as well as the see-through team as well. So just leave it at that. So to begin our program today, as I open my iPad that decided to close on me. So for today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Patrick Weiler, MP for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, sea to sky country. Yeah. Patrick is an environmental and a natural resource management lawyer and an international development professional with roots in the communities which he has been representing in Parliament since 2019. In his second term, Patrick sits on the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development and the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, and is a co-chair of All-Party Parliamentarianism Caucus, where he's advancing action on these important files in the 44th Parliament. So welcome to the stage, Patrick. Thank you. Hello again. So I think I kind of stole your thunder a little bit in terms of wanting you to kind of talk about your background. Is there anything that I missed that you'd love to share with the audience today?
Well, first, it's great to be here today. Thanks everybody for having me. There we go, that's better. Well, one role that I think is fairly relevant that I should bring up today is I'm going to be taking over the co-chair role for the Cannabis Caucus that we have here today. My colleague Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, unfortunately, can't be here today, but as well as Scott Reed, who's one of the other co-chairs. But I'm quite grateful to be following in his footsteps, and as George really mentioned earlier today, we know even over the 4-year anniversary of the legalization of recreational use of cannabis, we still have a lot of work to do. And so I think it's incredibly important, the work that's going to be done here over the next 2 days, just to really drive that point home. Because I don't think a lot of people really realize some of the major obstacles that the industry currently has right now. There still is a certain level of stigma that needs to be addressed. And so your work over the next couple of days will be really important, as well as feeding into the work that the industry's strategy table and the statutory review is going to be doing.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, even though I have some structured questions for Patrick, we are opening the floor as well to a few questions as well. So I want to start off by asking, building on your advocacy and the work on addressing barriers within the cannabis industry, namely like taxation and limitations to micro-cultivators, what steps do you think that we, the cannabis industry, should be taking? What relationships should we be building to prioritize the goals of making the cannabis industry more equitable and accessible?
Yeah, I think it really does start with education. Most MPs I talk to, they don't realize the size of the industry. They don't realize that there's about 50,000 direct jobs in the industry. They don't realize that it's about double the direct jobs that we see in the dairy industry. For instance, the fact that there's $43 billion in economic impact from this industry, but there are very real challenges. Other industries don't have to deal with the illicit market. Other industries don't have to deal with a level of taxation that is really holding industry back. So those are things that really, there's a certain level of education that needs to happen with MPs and with officials as well, and senators, I would say. And so I think it's really effective to, over the next couple of days, to really have those meetings and to be able to point to people the jobs that are at stake in your own ridings. Because a lot of people don't actually realize that. And this is an industry that's right across the country. And it provides a tremendous amount of, a tremendous amount of livelihood that's right across the country.
Right, and I kind of wanted to piggyback on terms of that education piece. How receptive are our political officials in terms of receiving information about the cannabis industry? Because, sometimes you have that resistance, or individuals have their own, ideas of cannabis in terms of, the stigma associated with it. So how receptive do you feel like we are right now that we're 4 years within legalization? It's around, everybody's seeing dispensaries. So what is the receptiveness, and how can we, overcome those barriers in terms of those who are not willing or having a hard time to understand?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because I think it really depends. I'm a member of Parliament for British Columbia, so this is not a particularly controversial thing in British Columbia. Although there are certain communities, I would say particularly the Chinese Canadian community, where cannabis is not necessarily seen in the best light, and so I think there's maybe a communication challenge that is at play there that needs to be carefully managed. But because there are even in British Columbia, in Richmond, which is a community where it's the vast majority of people are Chinese, and that community doesn't allow any dispensaries. So there are, I would say, some challenges that need to be navigated there. I think there is still this ongoing stigma from the war on drugs, where unfortunately cannabis got drawn into that need to be a little bit sensitive to that as well. So in terms of how to do that, I think it's just having being able to explain some of the challenges as well as the opportunities is really, really important. And actually, I had the opportunity to visit one of Aurora's facilities in my riding, and for me, that was really an eye-opener. Because I think for some people, they think it's a fairly disorganized industry, but having a chance to go see that facility in person was a huge eye-opener. The level of sophistication that takes place in there, I think really puts things in perspective. And so any opportunities you can take folks on site visits like that, I think would go a long way.
Okay, so from that, more site visit invitations for education. And building off of that as well, are there any insights that you can provide into maybe where the Liberal administration stands and any other priority areas regarding the cannabis policy review? So maybe looking at like taxation or even like economic opportunities, etc.
Yeah, so I'd say there's the two avenues, and I saw the agenda that later today you're going to have a chance to hear from Eric Corson, who's going to be leading the industry strategy table. And so I think when we're talking, when George mentioned the 18-month timeline on the statutory review, that is a very long time. I think we can do that much quicker than that, to be honest. But that doesn't stop progress from being made on a lot of the challenges that are seen in the industry, whether that's things like the excise tax, whether that's on the milligram content for edibles and otherwise. Those are conversations that can be had as part of the industry strategy table, which will be a little bit more of an iterative process where you'll be able to speak directly with officials. And that process, well, Eric will speak more of that later today, so I won't comment too much on that. But I think that will be an avenue to deal with some of those concerns. And when we're talking about the statutory review, the Act had a very, very limited amount of topics that were supposed to be covered in that. And based on a lot of conversations that especially myself and Nathaniel Larson-Smith had with officials, we really worked to broaden that in such that we would touch on some of the major challenges that we're seeing, like the continued presence of the illicit market. It's a huge challenge, especially in my province of British Columbia, where it hasn't had much of an impact in terms of taking over that part of the supply, I would say. And so we made sure that that was part of the strategy table as well. And so, that's both from the point of view of dealing with the black market, but also dealing with competitiveness issues that the industry is facing. So that's certainly an area that we're looking at. Also, some of the challenges with the medical licensing system right now. It is something I hear about from constituents quite often when you see that there are areas where you have medical licenses where they're not very well monitored or enforced, that's having issues and leading to concerns with neighbors on nuisance and noise pollution, things like that. So that's something that we're also looking at, and we're talking about making the industry more inclusive as well. We're particularly looking at ways of how we can better work with Indigenous communities and other racialized communities. There's many nations right across
Recording in progress.
Right across Canada that are looking at this as an economic development opportunity. We need to look at what we're going to do with taxation as we're tackling a number of different areas of taxation reform with Indigenous communities. So those are all areas that we're looking at. I think it's, I know that the BC Craft Growers Cooperative is going to be here this week as well. And I think there are opportunities to make sure that C3 and other advocacy groups are really working together on developing some no regret proposals that are put forward. Because I think we need to focus on the larger producers as well as the smaller producers. There's a major irritant with the micro production licenses. It's such a small amount that it's really impeding a lot of those smaller players from getting into the market where the economics just don't make sense. So I think looking at that, expanding that such that the business case is there, as well as tackling things like access to finance, cost of insurance. Those are major barriers for a lot of people to get into the market. So these are all things that we're going to be touched on through both the statutory review and the industry strategy table.
Right, and having worked in government it was a learning curve, to be honest with you, especially working in the cannabis licensing branch as well. And we've had conversations in terms of looking at the barriers, etc. And I think sometimes that there's a whole different aspect of it. It's not just Health Canada at all either. It's all the 1,000 departments that we have within government that have to be a part of these conversations. And are they as receptive to being part of these conversations, or where are they in terms of having these conversations? Are they also the ones that we should be bringing to these tables as well, not only just focusing on Health Canada as well, looking at CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, looking at even food inspection and all those different aspects that are part of the industry. How receptive and how willing are they to come to these events and be a part of it, to realize that they sometimes are the barriers in terms of the changes that we need to make?
I'm not sure if I have the greatest answer to that question, and I think the best entry point for a lot of those discussions is to go through the industry strategy table, because then you have a one-stop shop where you can kind of divert to those different agencies. One of the challenges I think that cannabis has had generally is, particularly during the pandemic, it was not the #1 Health Canada concern, not even close. And so, when you're talking about a lot of those different areas, it's really important to explain why this is such an urgent issue right now, why it needs to be dealt with, and why they need to have a dedicated person that's working on this issue. And so that is starting to change. There's a lot of people that are filling those positions now where, in my opinion, they were previously understaffed. So I really hope that will help. But I think it is still a challenge, because even over 4 years in, it is still a pretty new industry. And I think we all know how slow larger organizations in government operates, and so there still is a bit of a learning curve and some institutional formation that really needs to happen on those different agencies.
Great, 100%. And the other question I had for you was, are there any other opportunities for the cannabis industry that we should be aware of as we move forward into advocating and lobbying for our priorities to improve the cannabis industry, and I know we kind of hint on that, like 18 months is a very long time. I look into like my communities as well as that I'm a part of, like 18 months for you to realize that there are significant barriers within Black communities, for example. 18 months to realize that there may need to be a strategy. 18 months for a lot of communities, like George said, like we've been reiterating, is a long time. So what other opportunities are there for us to go beyond just a statutory review, and how do we go about doing that? Like, you know.
Yeah, well, I think we talked a little bit about it earlier. I think one of the main points is really looking at folks that might not have a high level of understanding right now, or maybe folks that have a particular concern with the industry, and taking them on a site visit, explaining what's going on, and really dispelling some of the misinformation that's out there. I think that's really, really important. And to give you an example, right now in the committee that I'm on, the Environment and Sustainable Development Committee, we're about to start a review of the Environmental Protection Act. And leading into this, both the environmental NGO, Environmental Defense, and the Chemical Industry Association, they both came together beforehand to agree on the approach that should be done for review and legislation. And I think that's really impactful when you can show you have a level of agreement on the way forward and what needs to be done, because it makes it very easy then for whether it's officials or parliamentarians to know that this is something that's going to have wide-scale social license. So having those conversations, I think, is really, really important. And I think that's some of the work that's going to come through the statutory review itself. But it doesn't need to wait 18 months for all that to take place. And then particularly having some off-ramps into the industry strategy table, I think, is a more near-term way of addressing some of those concerns. And then hopefully we can get some of the legislation passed a little bit quicker.
I heard about this.
Okay, thank you. And last one that I have, so if anybody has any questions, I'm sorry, my back is turned towards this group, but if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand. For my last question, I think we kind of touched on it, but in terms of advocacy and the challenges and the consultations and building those relationships, there's aspects of mistrust, of being not heard and ignored. What is the importance of advocacy? Like, you just give an example, but how important is the work that we're doing here? Because I've had conversations with people like, I'm not going to come to certain events because I just don't feel like it makes a difference. I feel like, so how important is advocacy in terms of the work that we do? How valued is it sometimes in the work that, within government or just, in the broader scheme of things?
Well, advocacy is absolutely critical. We're living in a pretty crazy time, a crazy world right now, and there's thousands of things that will take government's attention. You look at the impact of advocacy right now by the Iranian community and what that's led to pushing government to do more to hold the regime accountable. And that's a very concerted effort of tens of thousands of people, and you listen when you see that level of advocacy. So I think it's incredibly important, making it very real for people. When, like I said, talking about what that will mean for in a particular riding, in a particular community across the country. And unless you have that level of understanding, it will never be one of their number one issues. And so I think that level of work is really, really critical to take place. And this is, you look at other industries, this is how they're able to get things done. I mentioned the outsized influence the dairy industry has at less than half of the employment that the cannabis industry does. So it's the kind of work that needs to be sustained, and that really will help put things more on the front burner.
Absolutely. So I'm going to kind of bring it to the floor to see if anyone has any questions.